Hello everybody, this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine coming to you with another lesson on acoustic guitar. If you've gone back through a whole series of the things we've been talking about finding the key, the chords, and the melody by ear, and then how to embellish that to create your own solo. And so far we've been working with, on the guitar and mandolin, what I call the technique approach. We're using double stops, hammer-ons, slides, cross-picking, pull-offs, double stops, neighboring notes, toggles, tremolo, all these things. And interestingly enough, these are things that were around sort of prior to Doc Watson. You know, folks like Mother Babel Carter and Doc Addington and Ed Mayfield and various other, Riley Puckett, various other lead guitar players in country music, bluegrass music, George Shuffler with the cross-picking. Prior to when Doc Watson came on the scene, we're using these kind of techniques. Now when Doc came along, he started playing fiddle tunes on the guitar, and thus fiddle tunes are built of scale runs, descending and ascending scale patterns and what we call folded scale patterns. And so Doc and Clarence White and Tony Rice started putting some of these patterns into the playing to fill in between melody notes. And so if we chronologically evaluate the evolution of flat picking guitar and bluegrass music, we can see these things building upon one another. And in a book that I did called The Guitar Player's Guide to Creating Solos, or Developing Creative Solos, Guitar Player's Guide to Developing Creative Solos, I told you before that I have three sections of that book. One is technique-oriented solos, which we've gone through so far. The other was what I call theory-based solos, and the other one is intuitive-based solos. And the theory-based solos are revolve around arpeggios and scales, and that's sort of, you know, what our theory in music is based on, is playing the chords of the key and the scales of the key, and then getting a little bit outside of the key with both your chords and your scales. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is start getting into some of the scales that are commonly used in bluegrass music, and show you those scales and show you how you might use those, or how you might think about using those scales in soloing. So that's what we're all about today. I'm going to start with basically the chords, the notes that are in the chord. So if you're in the key of G, for instance, and you're playing a 1-4-5 progression, you've got the G chord, the C chord, and the D chord, and all of the notes in those chords are part of the scale of the key, so they're what we call diatonic to the key. And if you're playing over a chord and you hit notes that are in that chord, you're golden. That's sort of the default. It's never going to sound bad. It's never going to sound rotten. May not be the most creative solo or the most interesting solo, but you can never go wrong. And that's why we like to say the answer is always in the chord. If you're trying to solo over and the band is playing a G chord and you hit notes from the G chord, it's always going to sound okay. Same when the band changed to the C chord and you're soloing and you change the notes in the C chord, it's going to sound nice. And same with the D chord. And that's why the Carter style sounds good, because you're playing basically out of those chord shapes and interweaving melody notes around the chord strums. And that's why cross-picking works, because you're usually holding a chord, and double stops, you're usually holding a chord. So that's why those things we've talked about in the past work pretty well, because again, the answer is always in the chord, and the chord is always going to sound good. Now, you may want to go beyond that to sound a little bit more interesting than just playing the notes of the chord. And so over top of the three notes of the chord, which are the first, third, and fifth scale degrees of the chord, the scale of the chord, and again on a 1-4-5 progression, all of those notes for the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord are going to be out of the scale of the key of the root, the key. You know, if you're in the key of G, all of the notes from the C chord, all of the notes from the D chord, all of the notes of the G chord are in the G scale. Now, the next more complicated thing you might do is go to your major pentatonic scale. Penta means 5, so there's 5 notes in this scale, and you can think about the notes of the scale are building the notes of the scale in 2 different ways. The first is adding 2 notes to the 3 notes of the chord. The second is subtracting 2 notes from the 7 notes of the full scale. So if we look at 6 notes out of the G scale, we have the 1, the 3, and the 5 that are in the chord. In order to create the pentatonic scale, we're going to add the 2 and the 6. So we have 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. We're taking out the 4, right? Now if we want to think about having the whole scale, which is 7 notes, we're going to remove the 4, which is the C, and we're going to remove the 7, which is the F sharp in the key of G. So again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 is the major pentatonic scale. So in the key of G, just in the lower octave, it's going to be, and then back to G. Okay? A nice way to remember this is if you change the phrasing a little bit, it's going to sound like this. So if you know the old tune My Girl, that main riff in My Girl is basically a perfectly ascending major pentatonic scale in whatever key you're doing it in. So let's take a look at this scale in the key of G on the fingerboard in 2 octaves. It's going to be G to G. And so if we look at the strings and the frets, I want to show you, I want to count these. There's going to be a G note here on the low E string at the 3rd fret. Then I'm going to go 0, 2 on the A string, 0, 2 on the D string, 0, 2 on the G string, 0, 3 on the B string, and 0, 3 on the high E string. So that's our major pentatonic scale in G. Now the good news is it's a little bit more complicated than the 3 notes of the scale because we're adding 2 notes. But it's still very consonant, still very safe. A lot of your songs that you have in bluegrass, the melodies are made up of notes that are just in this scale. Lonesome Road Blues, 9-Pound Hammer, Long Journey Home, Amazing Grace, on and on. Lots of songs only use these 5 notes in their melody. So when that's the case, you can kind of just play around that scale when you're soloing and get by pretty well, okay? So let's say if I take a song like Lonesome Road Blues, and I'm just going to play those notes. Again, I got... Those are the notes I'm working with. So I'm going to think of a song like Lonesome Road Blues and try to solo over that. It might sound like this. Okay, so I just heard the melody in my head, and I saw this pattern of the G major pentatonic scale in my imagination, in my head, and then I played just notes, those 5 notes. That's all I used. And you can get away with that in a lot of songs. Again, we're sort of in the fake it till you make it kind of stage, but if you're thinking about solos and you're thinking about it in terms of scale patterns, this is a great one to use, especially if you figure out that the song melody is just using those 5 notes. And so you can do a lot of creative things. I did one slide up to here, but that's a G note, which is the same note here. I'm still staying in that scale. I just threw a slide in. But you can use these things in conjunction with your other techniques. For instance, the last time I started out, I could do a double stop there. I'll do a hammer on here. So you can throw in any of your other techniques we've already worked with, but think of them in terms of grabbing notes from the major pentatonic scale when you're doing your solo. And again, it's only 5 notes you have to worry about the entire time, and it's going to work on a lot of songs. Now, to go one step beyond that, what you'll think about next is playing the G major pentatonic scale, or the 1 chord major pentatonic scale over the 1 chord, the 4 chord major pentatonic scale over the 4 chord, and the 5 chord major pentatonic scale over the 5 chord. So over the G chord, I would do my, then over the C chord, over the D chord, and interestingly enough, every one of those notes that I just played is still staying in the key. In this case, the key of G. But the major pentatonic scale relating to the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord all relate to the scale of the 1, the scale of the key. So you can do this without going outside the key. And interestingly enough also is that the 2 notes we took out of the major scale in the key of G to make the pentatonic scale are the 4, which was a C, and the 7, which is a F sharp. When you play the C, obviously you're adding that C note back in, but we got C, D, E, G, A, C. All of those notes are in the G scale. When we go to D, we're adding that F sharp note back in. We're going D, E, F sharp, A, B, D. All of those notes are also in the G scale. So we're never leaving the key, but we're just organizing it in an interesting way that adds all of the notes of the scale, but organized differently over each chord. And that's another way you can think about this, going again one step more complex than just playing the G major pentatonic scale over the whole thing. Now you can play all the notes of the scale, but are organized as major pentatonic scale notes relative to the chord you're playing. So if I added that into something like Lonesome Road Blues, I'm going to add some notes here that are not in the melody. That C note is not in the melody, the F sharp note is not in the melody. But again, so we're getting a little bit, you know, adding a little bit of tension in there instead of being all very consonant, okay? So if I was to do a solo to Lonesome Road Blues and think about it this way, it might sound something like this. So that's, again, I've added a little bit more dissonance in there. I've taken notes outside of the major pentatonic scale, but I'm still staying within the scale of the key. So that is 2 different ways you can work with the major pentatonic scale. The first is just to stay with the major pentatonic scale of the key, and the second is in a 1-4-5 progression, change the major pentatonic scale relative to each chord that you're playing. So that's going to give you a little bit more interesting, a little bit more options. Again, as you might be able to see, I'm not playing these scales really in like ascending and descending order all the time. You can think of these scale notes as like pools of eligible notes that you can just grab from at any given time, and it's gonna work that way. You don't necessarily have to run up and down the scale in a linear fashion. So anyway. Let's move on next to the major blues scale. Okay, so the major blues, we're going to take the major pentatonic scale, again working with the major pentatonic scale relative to each chord, and we're going to add 1 note to that. It's a 6-note scale, and the note we add is the flat third. Remember, the pentatonic scale was 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. This is going to be 1, 2, flat 3, 3, 5, 6. And then back to 1. And those those of us that have played bluegrass guitar for a long time, you recognize that as your G run. Your G run is the major blues scale played right up the scale. You could do the same thing out of C, D. So to the G major pentatonic scale, we're adding a B flat. To the C major pentatonic scale, we're adding an E flat. To the D major pentatonic scale, we're adding an F natural. And so, you know, here, obviously I got that B flat here. I also got a B flat here, right? For C, I got that E flat here. Also got it here. So you can use all of those notes, and then, of course, you got your F natural there. You got it up there. So you've got these added extra notes, which are the flatted third relative to each pentatonic scale over each chord. You're going to flat the third and add that in. Don't get rid of your third. You're adding a third and keeping the third. So that's what we got. And so the way you're going to organize this is the same way we did last time, where you're going to play G major blues over the G scale, C major blues over the C scale, and D major blues over the D scale. Now adding that flatted note to each of those is going outside of the key, but again, we can add that bluesy feel. Bill Monroe and Doc Watson especially use the major blues a lot in the kind of music that they played, and it's very effective. So let's see, if I was going to play Lonesome Road Blues now, organizing it in this way, it might sound something like this. Okay, so that's all for today. We covered playing with the major pentatonic scale of the key over the whole solo. We covered changing the major pentatonic relative to the chord, and then we covered the major blues, which again changes scale every time you change the chord over a 1-4-5 progression. That's where this will work. So check it out, learn those scales, mess around with them, play with them, and see what you can come up with. Again, this is Dan Miller for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine. Thanks.